I'd like to extend a personal thank you to all sponsors, exhibitors and registrants who have offered to donate all or part of their registration or sponsorship fees to help offset the loss to the Society. I'd also like to make a special mention of EQC, who were originally scheduled to be a conference partner and who are now partnering with us to deliver this webinar series. EQC's support of our conference, along with their ongoing support of our bulletin publication and other Society activities, is greatly appreciated. I'd also like to extend our thanks to MBIE Building Performance, Taylor Devices, Geostabilisation International, Mainmark and QuakeCoRE for their contributions towards this webinar series. We are still working on publishing of proceedings for this year's conference papers. I apologise that we are a little bit behind schedule on this, largely due to the lateness of some peer review reports that are still outstanding. Many of the reviews have been received late, as some of our peer reviewers have been unable to complete their reviews while dealing with the ongoing implications of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, I am pleased to say that almost all reports have now been received, and these will be sent out to all authors in the coming days. Now, when it comes to papers, we understand that some authors will still like to publish their papers, while others may wish to withdraw their papers as they are no longer able to have an oral presentation to present this research. Either option is absolutely fine from the Society's point of view. The underlying principle that we're applying here is to give authors the choice of the outcome for their papers. Once the reviews are released and the authors submit their revised papers, we'll release a full proceedings of the papers where authors wish to have them published. Now, as well as the webinar today, I'd also like to remind everyone that we have the NZSEE AGM, which will be held tomorrow afternoon from 3 p.m. This will be done online, and all NZSEE members should have received an email invitation on the 6th of April and a reminder email on Monday this week. As well as the AGM formalities, we will be announcing the award winners for the NZSEE Awards this year. These include the NZSEE Research Scholarship, the Otto Glogo Award, the NZSEE EQC Ivan Skinner Award, the NZSEE QuakeCoRE Women Leaders in Earthquake Engineering Award, and the newly established Bulletin Service Award. We'll also be conferring life memberships and fellowships of the Society, and we invite all members to join for this event as we celebrate those who are achieving great things within our field and those who have contributed to the Society and to the profession over many years. Now, during this webinar, we will be using Pigeonhole to manage any questions that arise. This is a separate system to the Adobe Connect that is hosting the webinar and can be opened in a browser or on your computer or smartphone. The key thing is that even if you don't have a question, you can still vote for questions that have been asked by others. So therefore, you can ensure that questions that you see value are those that get asked. So just on the side of the screen here is the instructions for Pigeonhole. So please log into that and either ask your questions or vote for the appropriate questions that you'd like to see asked. That's about it for me regarding formalities. We really hope that this will be a meaningful and valuable webinar series and a good way to engage with our members while we deal with these challenging circumstances. I'll now pass over to Helen Furner, who, along with Ken Elwood, are the chairs for this webinar and will introduce the speakers. Over to you, Helen.
Perfect. Thank you, Jeff, and hello, everybody. In case you don't know, I'm Helen Furner, and I'm one of the Management Committee of NZSEE. And I'd like to note that it is the first time we've hosted a webinar, so please bear with us. It's obviously a consequence of the lockdown from COVID-19, and we're very appreciative of Engineering New Zealand for hosting this for us. We will be seeking input from people on what worked and what didn't following the session, so please let us know. We want to make this a success. And as Jeff just noted, we are going to use Pigeonhole for questions, so please use the device. And now what I'd like to do is introduce this first webinar in the series. In this one, we've titled up Building Resilience. It's an important topic, as I'm sure you agree, and much has been learned from the recent earthquakes about building resilience, with many questions from both within the profession and by the wider community. It seems timely to consider earthquake risk mitigation anew for the 21st century. The aim of this webinar is to prompt an ongoing conversation and to share ideas as to where to next. What we're going to do is run through all 4 presentations first, and each will take 15 to 20 minutes, and then we're going to have a question and discussion session at the end, which will be hosted by Professor Ken Elwood and myself. Obviously, you can start asking questions into Pigeonhole at any time and voting them up and down, and I'd encourage you to do so, and don't wait until all the presentations are done. It's now my great pleasure to introduce all 4 speakers, and I'm going to do it now, and then the plan is that each speaker will hand over directly to the next one. So first of all, we're going to have, let me put this up slide for you. There we are. First, we're going to have Mike Stannard, who was Chief Engineer at the Ministry of Building Innovation and Employment, MBIE, for 9 years until stepping down in 2018. What better person to talk to us about the building code and a possible rethink with his deep knowledge of the regulatory system. He'll be followed by Jenni Tipler. Jenni is the engineering team leader at MBIE, and she's going to provide an overview of MBIE's earthquake engineering work program currently underway and how they relate to the building regulatory system. Then we're going to have Professor Tim Sullivan, who will follow Jenni. And Tim is a professor at Canterbury University at the Engineering School, and he's a leader of QuakeCoRE Flagship 4, Low Damage and Repairable Design. Tim is going to talk about some of the research aimed at advancing tools for the seismic performance assessment of buildings that is currently underway. And to finish, we're going to have Rob Jury. Rob is the Chief Structural Engineer at Becker and an experienced code writer. And Rob will discuss the drivers for rethinking New Zealand's earthquake design standards and design approach and introduce some ideas for moving the discussion forward. We look forward to hearing from all 4 presenters, but Mike, if you'd like to start us off, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you for the opportunity. Certainly when I first contemplated writing this paper for the conference was quite a few months ago now. I thought I could just share some of my experience working with the building regulator as chief engineer during a turbulent yet transformative time and hopefully generate discussion for improvement. I'm delighted and flattered that the paper seems to have struck a chord, being aligned with the Society's initiative, Earthquake Risk Mitigation for the 21st Century, which seeks to rethink our design standards and approach. Meanwhile, there's been considerable change. To get onto the right thing. MBIE has embarked on similar initiatives that Jenni will talk about shortly. There's been new leadership appointed there, and the findings of the EQC inquiry with recommendations have just recently been released. Clearly, there is an alignment of thinking and the need to make changes. Now, COVID-19 has turned our world upside down. You could ask whether this is the time to contemplate change to building regulations and design when the country is facing much more serious health and financial issues. Will this get any priority at all at a political level? I would argue that now is the time to have a good debate and get a consensus and coherent views from the sector. So when the political opportunity comes along, and it may not be for a while, the decision makers can be well informed with credible, researched evidence. I'm really examining whether our current system is fit for purpose. We've had essentially the same building code since 1992, world-leading performance-based regulation at the time. However, New Zealand has changed. Our demographics are different, as are our ways of living. Product and building system possibilities have ballooned, and our awareness of building impacts on health and climate change has increased. We've also gone through, as a nation, a series of crises. We've had leaky buildings, a mining tragedy, earthquakes, an eruption, shootings, and now a pandemic. So are our perceptions of risks still as they were in 1992? I would suggest they're not, and that we can do better. I like the quote, as some of you will know, from the European philosopher George Santayana. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Therefore, a quick reminder of code development history. The first known building code was from ancient Mesopotamia, 4,000 years ago, the Hammurabi Code. It was pretty brutal, and as you can see, if a homeowner is killed because of the house construction, the builder is killed. It did perhaps recognise that information asymmetry between builder and owner is still very much a driver for today's codes. More recent drivers for code development have been major events. We've had the Great Fire of London, and we've had a number of earthquakes. Codes have traditionally addressed life safety and health issues, but they're now increasingly being used as an instrument of social policy to help address wider societal objectives, such as well-being, energy efficiency, sustainability, and resilience. It does need to be remembered that the code is only part of the picture. The building code system is only one part of a much wider system that will influence outcomes. These include commercial arrangements and drivers, New Zealand legal and taxation systems, liability, access to finance, insurance, expectations of users, research and knowledge, land planning, consents approvals process, and the competence and ethics of all parties to the building process. So what is the building code system and how is it used in practice? Clearly, we need to start with client requirements to determine their needs and understand their attitudes to risk. It's then a matter of turning the design brief into a full design, making sure that minimum legal performance is met. Most of you will be familiar with the regulatory triangle I have on the right-hand side of this diagram, and I refer to that as the building code system. The Act empowers the code and the various compliance pathways, whether it be alternative solution, verification method, or acceptable solution, informed by statutory guidance that can be directed at either the Act level, the code level, or at the design level. And the whole thing is underpinned by standards and industry practice and information. So what is good building regulation? The list here is adapted for building regulations from the New Zealand government expectations of regulators. It should reflect societal expectations, recognising the social compact between Parliament and people. It needs to be aligned with other regulatory systems, constitutional principles and treaty obligations. It needs to be proportionate and fair to all parties. It should be clear, easy to access, and easy to interpret the requirements. It should be flexible, proactive, and evolving, responding to changing circumstances or new information. It's not a set and forget type system. It should encourage affordable and efficient building practices and promote innovation. And it needs to reflect current knowledge and sector competence and practice. And it's important, as poor regulation can impose costs, limit freedoms, stifle innovation, and give rise to unintended consequences. And there have been plenty of examples of that. So what's been our New Zealand experience? We've had the leaky buildings issues costing billions and causing a lot of pain and distress to thousands of homeowners. We've had a real increase in seismic activity since the mid-2000s, which has led to a much wider awareness of the impacts of earthquakes and the vulnerability of our built environment. Than we'd had in the relative quiescence of the second half of the 20th century. The experience has also led to much greater understanding of building and ground performance and seismicity, and many changes occurred in no small part to the work of the Canterbury Earthquakes Royal Commission and to the collaborative efforts of the earthquake engineering community. This new learning from earthquakes has been captured and consolidated with important research from the likes of QuakeCoRE, Quake Centre, the universities, GNS, brands and other organisations, much of it funded by MBIE and EQC. We can and have learned from international experience, and I would say we must learn from international experience. But it's important to be mindful that the context in other countries can be quite different. The World Bank emphasises the importance of good building regulation, illustrated by developing countries being disproportionately affected during natural hazard events. There has been a trend internationally towards performance-based regulation. An Australian study has demonstrated billions of dollars in benefits since it was introduced there. However, there is a call for providing greater specificity in performance requirements. Dame Judith Hackett, in her investigation into the Grenfell Tower fire in the UK, concluded that design needs to be outcomes-based and design should not be a box-ticking exercise. We've also learned plenty from the Society's learning from earthquakes reconnaissances over the years. The reconnaissance to Kumamoto, Japan in 2016 was a good example. In many ways, Kumamoto had similarities to Canterbury. The first earthquake in both sequences did not cause the major loss, and the level of shaking of the two main shocks was comparable. However, there were stark contrasts. While there was significant building damage, Kumamoto City, 3 months later when we were there, seemed to be operating pretty much as normal. Sorry, losing the thing. 9 years on, in Christchurch, there has been major reconstruction in the CBD, but there remains very large areas of demolished or waiting to be demolished buildings. However, the collapse of residential houses in Mashiki town, east of Kumamoto, caused a number of fatalities. Heavyweight roofs and post and beam construction in older housing stock fared much worse than the typical New Zealand light wood-framed, light-roofed houses, unless, of course, they were subject to ground damage. So where are we? The cost of lack of resilience has been high, costing us billions per annum in both financial and social terms. Insurance costs have increased, and sometimes it is not even available. Structural performance requirements are described at too high a level. The continuum of performance being aimed at is not described adequately. Design demand requirements, the hazard side, do not match the current science. There are examples of poor design practice being built. There are areas of unnecessary complication and lack of clarity within the system. And geotech, fire, structural and non-structural design and construction can be siloed and not always well coordinated. I make a few suggestions that I believe will make a difference in relation to seismic resilience and code clarity. Firstly, currently the Act and Code really only address life safety. There should be a debate seeking views from the public about incorporating property protection into our building requirements. The Wellington Mayoral Forum is already calling for this to happen. Japan does it, and we've seen the results. I've often heard New Zealand couldn't afford this, and it is something we'll need to address robustly. However, on a GDP per capita basis, Japan and New Zealand are very similar. They can do it. Why not us? Secondly, I've mentioned the trend internationally is to have performance-based building regulation, but with better definition of performance somewhere in the code system. What do we mean by low probability of rupture? This is currently left to standards committees to define, when it's a public policy issue and should not be their responsibility. However, getting too prescriptive in a mandatory code requirement is fraught, as predicting earthquake performance is very difficult. We've had this before when more prescriptive criteria were added into the fire code, causing considerable unintended consequences. My suggestion would be to describe the intended continuum of performance using the ICC performance-based building code, tolerable impacts framework. It is essentially describing, in layperson language, what is tolerable across the various levels of earthquake shaking, what we're aiming for in terms of impact on people, occupation. What I was saying was it's essentially a layperson, in layperson language, what is tolerable across various levels of earthquake shaking. What we're aiming for in terms of the impact on people, on occupation, on building damage and contents, etc. And for example, the standard as it currently sits, our design standards, is per this brown line here, at a 500 level of shaking, we would have a relatively high impact on the building. Whereas at a 25-year earthquake, we would have pretty mild impacts. Now, the blue line is what I'm suggesting might be the case if we incorporate property protection into the system. But obviously that can move either way, backwards and forwards, depending on the settings. Rather than being included in the code, I'm suggesting that could be signalled in statutory 175 guidance, providing direction to standards committees to turn these descriptions into engineering criteria and limits. The powers to issue guidance was added to the 2004 Act specifically in response to the lack of clarity about weather tightness issues. Let's use it or some other non-mandatory mechanism to provide greater clarity. Very briefly, I add 3 other suggestions. Thirdly, review and consolidate all the building classification systems currently included in the code system to simplify and provide greater clarity. Additionally, the classification should consider the impact that the building has on other buildings and on the wider urban environment. Which buildings are really the most important that should be designed more robustly? Currently, there are at least 6 different classifications within building controls, let alone anything else outside of the Building Act. You've got 2 lots of importance levels, either the A1 and for fire or 1170 for structural, and they're not identical. You've got risk groups for fire, change of use provisions, and risk groups in the visibility and means of escape. These silos are confusing, unnecessarily complicated, and only consider a building singly and not how it interacts with other buildings and the community. Fourthly, introduce a random audit system of designs to improve code compliance. And fifthly, undertake a fundamental design review of design standards and verification methods, aligned with the tolerable impacts set per suggestion 2 and classifications per suggestion 3. Change isn't easy, but I'm reminded that I have heard the piercing screams of a woman already traumatised by the Darfield earthquake, desperately trying to escape from the high-rise Christchurch Central Police Station during a major aftershock. Some of us have listened to the families of victims of the Christchurch earthquake, asking why. Many of us have experienced, either directly or indirectly, the stress, anxiety, and anger of having to repair or rebuild homes damaged by earthquake or leaky building issues. All of us will hope that our children or grandchildren will not, in the words of Santayana, be condemned to repeat our experience. The opportunity is now. It needs boldness, imagination, and informed evidence. A partnership is required, with MB as the steward of the system, the sector providing coherent and informed advice, and a wider collaboration with all community interests. Let's do it for the sake of New Zealand's health and well-being. So thank you, and I remind you about any questions to the pigeonhole, and I'll now pass you over to Jenni Tipler from MB, who will provide an overview of MB's Earthquake Engineering Work Programme.
Kia ora koutou, welcome and thank you for the opportunity to speak at this seminar. I'm Jenni Tipler, Engineering Team Leader with MB's Building System Performance Branch. MB's Earthquake Engineering Work Programme is about doing the right things and prioritising the work that will have the biggest impact, remembering that as public servants we are here first and foremost to serve the public. Making sure that we're looking across the whole building system, from existing buildings to new buildings and buildings of the future, and never losing sight of the reason we do what we do, which is to protect people from harm. But it's also about doing things right, ensuring that our work is part of a well thought out strategy and that we're taking the best approach. This means we have to leverage all of the resources at our disposal. My team has 8 engineers, and that's not nearly enough for us to make the changes that need to be made alone. Doing things right means reaching into the sector for advice, expertise and wisdom that far exceeds our own, and creating partnerships that enable us to transform the way that buildings are designed and constructed. MB take our Earthquake Engineering Work Programme seriously. We have a well thought out strategy and approach that will evolve as we learn and continue to refine it. But it represents a big focus for my team and a considerable investment of time, money and effort. Today I'm going to provide you with an overview of this work programme and provide you with an update on some key pieces of work I expect will be of primary interest to this audience. I'll start by talking about the regulatory setting for this work, then I'll explain how MB is partnering with Engineering New Zealand on a number of technical projects, 2 of which I'll highlight in more detail, which are Tukahika Low Damage Seismic Design and the Seismic Risk Working Group that MB has established. All of the work we do in the Building System Performance Branch is underpinned by the Building Act, which lays out the framework for the entire building regulatory system in New Zealand. This and the building code that sits underneath are enacted by Parliament and are mandatory for all building work. Below the building code sit the acceptable solutions and verification methods that you're likely to be more familiar with, and the cited standards that sit within these. The regulatory system is for all buildings all over New Zealand. This doesn't mean we take a one-size-fits-all approach, but it does mean that we have to consider the needs of all New Zealanders, whether they live in Wellington or Westport. It includes existing buildings, in particular mostly older buildings that fall under the earthquake-prone building legislation because they pose the greatest life safety risk to the public. clear and accessible. It can be understood. Documents like standards can be accessed for free. The building code sets minimum performance requirements, but as stewards of the building and construction sector, MBIE also has a role in supporting and encouraging best practice. This means raising awareness and understanding of what code minimum delivers and making it easier for those who are targeting a higher level of performance. The system has to be balanced and fair, weighing risks and rewards, and follow regulatory principles like ensuring that we consult with the public and take everyone's views on board before making decisions. It's also impartial. This means that unfortunately we'll never end up with the building code according to Jenni Tipler or any other individual or organisation, because all views are taken on board and objectively assessed. As the building regulator, MBIE must consider what regulatory interventions are appropriate for existing buildings, new buildings, and buildings in the longer term. What is appropriate for existing buildings may not be appropriate for new and future buildings, so we think about these in different ways. Existing buildings are covered by the earthquake-prone building legislation, which focuses on those buildings, predominantly older, that pose the greatest risk to public safety. The primary objective of the EPB system is to protect the public from harm without imposing unreasonable costs on building owners. This means setting a relatively low bar that focuses on life safety, while encouraging owners to consider going beyond the minimum requirements to further mitigate their risks. All new buildings must comply with the building code, which sets minimum performance requirements that strike a balance between protecting building owners from risk while keeping costs at a reasonable level. However, we must also consider how to encourage the sector to target higher performance standards and to ensure that building owners and designers are able to have clear conversations about expected levels of performance. And we must do all of this without losing sight of what we might expect from buildings in the future. So we must look ahead, define a vision for the future, and set the strategy for getting there. As I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, my team has 8 engineers, and we need to be able to effectively reach into the sector to leverage additional resource and expertise if we're going to affect bigger change. So we've partnered with Engineering New Zealand, which started as an 18-month pilot program to see how things work. Engineering New Zealand provide project management support for MBIE, but anyone who has worked with Eleanor and Kaya over this time will confirm that they do so much more. They have strengthened and supported engagement with technical societies, both in terms of the relationship between MBIE and these societies, but also by bringing the societies together. They formed a technical challenge group to bring together the primary engineering technical societies in the building sector and support better consistency in the technical advice that MBIE receives from these societies. Currently, we have 4 projects underway, but due to the success of the partnership, we're looking to extend the program and add new projects. So why are we doing this? MBIE and Engineering New Zealand recognise that we have key shared organisational objectives to support the sector, improve design practice, and protect the public. The partnership ensures that the technical advice MBIE receives is independent and that it's not unduly influenced by particular individuals or organisations. It's enabled us to scale up the work we do and improve the quality and quantity of advice that we receive. It's also enabled us to build stronger stakeholder relationships. As I mentioned, we're currently working on 4 technical projects with Engineering New Zealand, with quite a few more in the pipeline. The first of these is to gather evidence on the impacts of the yellow chapter C5 compared to the red book used to assess buildings under the EPB system, which relates to existing buildings. Whilst the yellow chapter may represent the latest engineering thinking, any changes to the EPB assessment criteria have the potential to create uncertainty for building owners and a perception that we're changing the goalposts only a few years into a 35-year program of strengthening. Therefore, it's crucial that MBIE understand the impacts of this change before considering any formal changes to the system. The second project is the finalisation of the Geotechnical Earthquake Engineering Practice Series, the modules, which is being undertaken in collaboration with the New Zealand Geotechnical Society. The geotechnical practice series currently sits within the regulatory system as guidance and applies to the design of new buildings. The practice series has 6 modules, and each document in the series is being updated and finalised. The third project, Tukahika Low Damage Seismic Design, is all about encouraging design that goes beyond code minimum and creating buildings that experience less damage from earthquakes. The project work is intended to be for information only and used to design new buildings and those of the future. And finally, MBIE has established a working group to start advising us about possible new technical approaches to representing seismic risk in the building system. It's very early days for this work and too soon to speculate on the regulatory status, but it's focused on critically assessing the current system that applies to new buildings and suggesting options for consideration with regard to design of buildings of the future. There are more projects in the pipeline, but for today I'll focus on updating you on our 2 seismic projects. At the moment, there's a mismatch between building regulation and public expectations. The building code is about protecting people's lives. It's not designed to create buildings that will survive and remain functional after significant earthquakes. New Zealand needs buildings that are more resilient. This means buildings that can be occupied and used after a significant earthquake, minimising economic losses and enabling faster recovery. The objective of the Low Damage Seismic Design project is ultimately about creating buildings that experience less damage from earthquakes. So we've commissioned work that is managed by Engineering New Zealand in partnership with CSOC, with input from NZSEE. We've recognised the work done over many years by engineers to develop a strong technical basis for defining and delivering low damage seismic design outcomes, and this project will build on that work and make it accessible to new audiences so it gets adopted and used. The project will help building owners and developers commission low damage seismic design buildings, and as such we're also working closely with the property and insurance industries to ensure the information resonates with these important audiences. Our steering group includes representation from the Insurance Industry Council, Property Council New Zealand, New Zealand Institute of Architects, EQC and NZSEE, as well as CSOC. The project has been through a detailed phase of customer interviews and understanding a range of perspectives from pre-design through to construction. Client-facing information is being developed first, which outlines the basics of low damage seismic design and creates a framework for presenting information that meets customer demand. The appointed technical leads for this project are currently discussing how to correlate or benchmark desired building performance outcomes in language that owners understand with design parameters that are understood by engineers. Depending on the insights the technical leads provide, this may include insights regarding the costs and value for building owners. The project's technical leads are also mapping out the respective roles and responsibilities to encourage collaboration across the design and delivery process in support of low damage design outcomes. I can assure you that once we've created this information, we will be making sure that everyone knows about it. So a seismic risk working group has been established to start advising MBIE about possible new technical approaches to representing seismic hazard in the building system. We recognise that it's been a while since the New Zealand hazard model was updated and are looking to lay the groundwork so that we're well prepared whenever any future seismic hazard modelling data comes in. We're questioning the status quo, looking at what we can learn from our international colleagues and asking what's best for us. Engineering New Zealand is managing this project and facilitating the group's progress. A small working group has been appointed comprising practitioners from industry, academics and a seismologist from GNS Science. We've brought these individuals together to help us scope up some work that may or may not have regulatory implications. In time, as this work shapes up, we will be looking to canvass opinions from a much wider group of interested stakeholders, including NZSEE, as a key technical society for earthquake engineering in New Zealand. So far, this group has worked together to assess the current system before moving to develop possible concepts and ideas for change. I'd like to reiterate that this is early preliminary work. We haven't yet determined how we will select recommendations to progress further or develop a project to undertake that work. The current work is due to be completed in May this year, so it's the very beginning of a process to inform possible regulatory or legislative changes in the future, and more work will be needed. So I hope you'll be open to helping us with this. I've focused a lot today on the work we're doing with Engineering New Zealand, but I'd like to finish up by briefly summarising some of the other work the team is doing. We'll soon be releasing information on the design of tsunami vertical evacuation structures. We're scoping updates to a number of standards, including 3404 and 3604. We've got a huge program of much needed work in the geotechnical engineering space, which I would love for the team to have an opportunity to share with you at another time. And we're delivering continual improvements through our biennial building code updates. As I mentioned at the start of my presentation, government simply can't affect the change we need without your help. I therefore strongly encourage you to tell us what you think. You can do this through our public consultation process, through the technical representatives on the Building Code Technical Risk Advisory Group, or by contacting me or my team directly. We are not the experts, you are. So please share your expertise, not just with us in Engineering New Zealand, but with everyone in your organisation to support continuous improvement in the sector. Thank you, and I'll now pass over to Tim Sullivan.
Thanks, Jenny, and kia ora everyone. So thanks to Helen and Ken for this opportunity to talk today. I'm going to talk about seismic loss assessment research, thinking about some alternative seismic, how this can inform our alternative seismic performance criteria. The research that I'm going to be talking about is mainly been done within QuakeCoRE, and we've got ongoing research activities both in QuakeCoRE and also within the Resilience to Nature's Challenge built environment theme. So the first question I'd like to raise is why seismic loss assessment? If we think about what happened in the February 2011 event, we had 185 deaths, which given the earthquake intensity, one could argue was somewhat of a success. However, we had more than $40 billion of losses, and we had major social and well-being impacts. And of course, Mike has highlighted some of these issues, but what we really can clearly see is that life safety is not enough. The reasons to look at loss assessment is that the information on losses is clearly of relevance to the insurance industry, and losses are likely correlated to downtime and disruption. And we recognise that controlling the downtime and disruption of our buildings in a post-earthquake scenario is important, and we could probably expect that there's some correlation between that. So if we can control losses, we could mitigate or limit the downtime and disruption. So if we're going to do loss assessment, then one could ask, well, what intensity of shaking should we consider? How about losses associated with, say, a 500-year return period intensity level, something like we use for seismic design in the ultimate limit state? How relevant would that have been for the Canterbury earthquakes? Well, this image shows the intensity recorded at different sites across Canterbury in the February 2011 event at a period of vibration of 0.5 seconds. And you notice that the colour-coded sites, according to the intensity, and there's just one site out to the north in Kaiapoi, where, let's see if I can get where the intensity was roughly 100% the design intensity, or the 500-year intensity level. However, this site had about 6 times the design intensity. If we instead went to a period, though, of 3 seconds, the picture changes completely. We can see that the site that was previously 6 times is now at the 500-year intensity level. So why am I highlighting this? The main point is to say that in an earthquake, we have a whole range of different intensity levels, and it's for this reason it makes little sense for us to talk about losses at a specific intensity level. Instead, we should be looking at, and this was the conclusion for our research focus, was to focus on the expected annual loss, sometimes referred to as the average annual loss, because this is a loss measure that accounts for intensity, a whole range of intensity levels expected at a site. So how does this do this? How is the expected annual loss computed? Well, if we have information as shown in this picture here, which shows the cost to repair a building as a function of the earthquake intensity, then, and just to clarify what I mean by that, you can see 5 different intensity levels here. If we had this building, we said if we had a medium earthquake intensity, we expect that the cost to repair the building would be about 10% of the replacement cost. If the earthquake intensity is high intensity, we think the repair cost is about 50% what it would cost to replace it, and so on. Now, with that sort of information, if we combine that with the rate at which we expect that earthquake intensity to occur, then we can multiply the numbers together and work out our expected annual loss. So it's simply 1 on 25 by 10% plus 1 on 400 by 50%, and so on. We sum those up and we get, in this case, an expected annual loss, or an average annual loss of 0.66%, the building replacement cost. So then the question is, well, how would we establish a relationship between the repair cost as a function of intensity? We do that through a 3-step process, and this is what the process we've been doing in our research. So we do a first phase, which is structural analysis, where we build a model of our structure and we say, okay, what is the likely drift we expect if the earthquake intensity is, say, 0.4 G at the period of vibration of the structure. We select ground motions that are compatible with the intensity of that shaking level, and we run our time history analyses and work out drifts, we work out floor accelerations, and then they become inputs to the next part of the assessment process, which is damage analysis. So that's a phase where we're saying if the drift is, say, 1%, what is the likely damage to, say, a partition wall? Of course, we need to consider all damageable components in a building. To do this, we need to have information on the fragility of the components. So you can see this could be fragility functions for partition walls, and we would read in with our drift of 1% and read off the likelihood or the probability of being in a certain damaged state. If we would have identified, say, for example, light damage, then we would go to the next step, which is repair costs. And we would say, okay, if the damage is light, what are the repair works required? And for a partition wall, we might have to stop and paint the walls. And we need to estimate the costs associated with that work. And we, through this process, therefore, we're able to estimate the cost of repairing all the components for that intensity level. And we're going to repeat that for all intensity levels that we're interested in. So what research have QuakeCoRE and now the Resilience to Nature's Challenge as well and been doing in relation to loss assessment? We've been doing the following 3 things. We've been trying to improve our knowledge of the fragility of building components. We've been quantifying or benchmarking the expected annual loss for different building typologies designed to current New Zealand standards. And we've been investigating the impact of changes to design criteria on the expected annual loss. So we've been looking at the impact of low damage design solutions and different possible serviceability limit state criteria. As an example of some research into the fragility of components, here's some photos and images from research we did on plasterboard partition walls. This research was done in collaboration with industry. I should point out that all the research I'm presenting is not necessarily my own research. It involves researchers from around the country. In this case, it was Rajesh Dakal, Professor Dakal, and Josh Mulligan. And they were testing these partition walls with fire-rated connections. So if you can see a joint there, which this is a fire-rated wall. And we find that the median drift capacity for this partition wall was only 0.29%. So quite a small drift capacity at which we start to see that repairs are required. We don't need to replace the wall, but we do need to repair it at that point. We also tested low damage partition wall systems, plasterboard walls, and we can see we can increase the drift capacity, and we can increase it quite a bit depending on the size of the gap we provide between the sheets. And for information on that, you can refer to the work of Tazil, Judith, Panin, and Palermo, for example. Another interesting study we've done in fragility is to look at commercial glazing systems. This is a photo of a 3.6 metre commercial glazing system, a fairly standard system in New Zealand. And behind it you see a water box, a blue sort of a box, where there are nozzles that are going to spray water onto the glazing. What we did in this test is we racked or we displaced laterally the top floor to higher drifts. After every couple of cycles at a certain drift level, we would then spray the glazing at a controlled air pressure in line with the New Zealand standard NZS 4284. From that process, we are able to track the drift at which we start to see loss of water tightness. And for some of our specimens, we're getting this loss of water tightness at reasonably low drifts. One specimen there as low as 0.15%. Of course, we go to higher and higher drifts, and as we do, we see more signs of damage. We see gaskets falling out, and we see glass breaking and so on. But those damage states don't occur until much higher levels of drift. In fact, this is a summary of the results for that first series of tests, and we saw drifts at up as around 5% for a life safety issue. So we see that life safety is not really an issue. If we can sustain about 5% before the glass breaks, but serviceability is an issue because the medium drift capacity for this glazing was, for loss of water tightness, was 0.35%. Other research of relevance for loss assessment here was to say, look at losses in terms of how do we quantify losses knowing the damage, meaning how do we quantify repair costs. And Professor Takal's been doing quite a bit of research in this field. This specific slide shows research building on work done by Clifton et al. On EBF systems, where we recognise that talking with industry that the cost to repair these links is greatly affected by how easy it is going to be to access and do the repair works. So if you look at our repair cost functions, a lot of the cost was associated with actually removing and then reinstating non-structural elements, including services and the like, within the damaged zone. Of course, that makes us wonder if we should be reconsidering our concept design approach. And arguably, it would be great if during our concept design we could locate our non-structural elements away from the parts of our structure that are going to require repair. And that's perhaps a challenge for our future concept design strategies. I also wanted to show you these figures because these are figures showing these are drawings of the QuakeCoRE case study buildings, what we call the QuakeCoRE case study buildings. We developed these layouts and drawings in consultation with the industry, talking with engineers and architects to come up with what was considered a realistic sort of office or commercial type building layout. And this is the level of detail we need to be able to do a loss assessment, a detailed loss assessment study. So with this sort of information, we can then do studies of the like shown here, where we designed those QuakeCoRE case study buildings as moment-resisting frame structures. We designed them for sites in Auckland, Christchurch, and Wellington for buildings of 4 to 12 stories. And we designed them in this first study here as moment-resisting frames two different ways. One with a traditional type of beam column connection, and one with a low damage friction type connection. We wanted to see what was the impact of those two different connection types on the overall losses. So everything else in the building is the same, the non-structural elements and so on, but the only difference is the impact of those connections. And of course, the design approach is slightly different for the two connections types. And what we found here is that if you look at the expected annual loss for these two buildings, there are 4 stories on the top and the 12-story at the bottom. Traditional frame loss, the expected annual loss for a building, a 4-story building in Wellington, was expected to reduce by about 20% if we use friction connections. So we can see how loss assessment here can be useful in highlighting the potential impact of what would otherwise be considered two exactly, let's say, similar code compliant buildings. Other studies include looking at steel eccentrically braced frames versus steel moment resisting frames. Again, the QuakeCoRE case study buildings have been used to do this. We redesigned them also as eccentrically braced frame buildings. And here you can see a summary of the losses obtained. Now, interestingly, for 4-story buildings, you can see whether you're in Christchurch or Wellington, EBFs are expected to have less expected annual loss than MRFs. So if we went to a 12-story building, we found that the opposite is true. In 12-story buildings, the MRFs are starting to have less loss than the EBFs. And this is partly to do with the way that floor accelerations change and are more significant in the 12-story building, and it's also to do with the drift profile. And these results are also affected by the quantities of our non-structural elements. So I guess in reality, what this is showing is that there are going to be a number of factors affecting our expected annual loss for a building. Depends on building typology. We've also been looking at concrete wall buildings. This study is showing investigating the impact of using long walls versus more short walls. We said, well, let's design this building in the first instance with a number of 6-metre walls, and the second instance with more 3-metre walls. Of course, again, both designs done exactly to meet the New Zealand standards, and then we do our loss assessment studies. And in this case, it was interesting to find that the long wall system ended up with about a third of the expected annual loss of the 3-metre wall system. There's a couple of main reasons for that. One is because 3-metre wall system tends to have more drift, and the other reason is because we have more walls that require repair once damage does occur, and this tends to have a bigger impact on the expected annual losses. We have and we continue to research into other building typologies, including low damage buildings such as base isolated buildings, hybrid rocking wall structures, structures with viscous dampers. And we're also looking at housing. Mike pointed out that our housing was really good from a life safety point of view, which is really true. But we recognise that from a losses point of view, we do need to help reduce the damage and disruption to housing as well. How does our losses of New Zealand buildings compare with international practice? This figure shows a couple of results of loss assessment studies done internationally where they followed a similar process. The results we have been obtaining suggest that our losses are between 0.03 to 0.3%. Should emphasise that our studies are ongoing, but that 0.03 and the 0.03% is for buildings, say in Auckland, with low seismicity, which does affect the results a lot. If you put those on the graphs that we can find in the literature, you can see that California, with a much higher seismicity for concrete frame buildings, and of course I haven't got results yet for concrete frames in here, but they're quite higher in California. Whereas if you look at our results in relation to results in Italy for new buildings, they're similar. And you can see the steel buildings quite low in Italy. But again, it does depend on the seismicity. Into the final part of why we're doing this, we can start looking at the impact of our seismic design criteria on losses. And one topic we're interested in is looking at the serviceability limit state. There have been recent proposals to change the serviceability limit state design criteria to increase the return period from 25 to 50 years. This was proposed by Moore as well as Pettinger, with slightly different suggestions about what the drift limit should be for the serviceability limit state. So what we would like to see from our research is how effective would such changes be in limiting losses, and then ask the question, is there a more effective approach? To help answer that question, you can see here some results of loss assessments done internationally, different studies. And what I wanted you to notice from these results, which showed the repair cost as a function of intensity, is that repair costs, this is total building repair cost, tends to increase in a roughly linear fashion. Roughly linear because, and that means we can make this approximation, it is just an approximation, where we can say we don't expect to see any loss until we get to an intensity that causes our serviceability limit state to be exceeded. And after that point, we think that losses are going to increase in a relatively linear fashion up until the point we have to basically replace the building. And for shaking intensity higher than that, of course, the repair cost is equal to the replacement cost. So if we make that an approximation, we can then start to say, well, if we can start to investigate the impact of different scenarios in our code, say having a serviceability limit state return period of 25 years, or 50 years, or 100 years, presuming or making an approximation that the loss associated with replacement would be occurred at an intensity at which we have a 500-year return period shaking intensity. Now, that is quite an approximation, but it does permit us to investigate how a change in our serviceability limit state return period could impact the expected annual loss. So we take this relationship between loss and intensity, and for some reason I'm missing an arrow here, but anyway, it's a relationship between loss and intensity. We combine that with hazard data, and we are able to compute what the actual expected annual losses are for different scenarios. So you can see increasing the return period at which we design for the serviceability limit state does successfully reduce our losses. The other thing we can notice from this sort of study is that the value of expected annual loss is going to change quite a bit according to the building location. So we in Christchurch or Wellington, our code compliant building losses are not going to be necessarily the same if we just design this way with a change in return period being the same for all sites. Which then prompts the possibility is, this is one alternative possibility, might be to consider a Z factor for the serviceability limit state, as we do have a Z factor for the ultimate limit state. And we could do research to tell us what is the Z factor for the serviceability limit state that would ensure that we have a limit to expected annual loss that's satisfied across the country. What that's really suggesting is we don't necessarily have to design all for the same return period at serviceability limit state if we want to achieve the same outcomes in terms of losses. What about low damage design criteria? Research is also investigating how we could inform the choice of design criteria for low damage buildings. One option would be to set a higher return period or intensity for shaking design at the serviceability limit state for low damage buildings. Another option might be to even introduce a new limit state and say, well, perhaps we keep the serviceability and the ultimate limit state the same, but we introduce a new limit state which we say, well, at this limit state, for example, the repair cost should be no more than 10% the replacement cost. With loss assessment, what we can do is we can start to quantify how significant those changes would be in terms of expected annual losses. What is the difference then between a standard design and a low damage design? Of course, what we rely on before we can set a number, and perhaps we shouldn't be setting a specific number, maybe we should just be providing indications, but we do need to answer the question, what should be the maximum expected annual loss for a low damage building? Should it be half of a standard design building, or a quarter, or what do stakeholders, what are they looking for? So in conclusion, research informed by lessons from recent earthquakes and with industry input is helping advance our knowledge and tools for building-specific loss assessment. Results obtained to date suggest that code-compliant New Zealand buildings have relatively low losses, but loss is very dependent on the local seismicity. And loss assessment studies such as those reported herein can help support the definition of new design criteria and codes, and we'll continue to do research in this area. So with that, kia ora and thank you, and I'm going to pass over to Rob. And I just remind people to, of course, post their questions onto the Pigeonhole.
It's Helen Ferner here, just interrupting Rob in just a moment. Before we start, I'm noticing that lots of people are entering questions into Pigeonhole, but are you aware that if you scroll down, you'll see a lot more questions that have been entered, and you might want to start voting them up and down. So just a thought that you might like to try that. Anyway, Rob, thank you, Tim, and welcome, Rob. I look forward to hearing your presentation. Sorry for interrupting.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you, Tim. And good afternoon, everyone. These are indeed interesting times. This afternoon, I'm going to cover several issues relating to achieving earthquake resilience, some of the drivers for changing the status quo, and some of those you've already heard this afternoon, and a proposal that we have to advance the overall discussion on this issue. My perspective comes from a 40-year career as a consulting engineer addressing client issues, and now over 30 years involvement with earthquake standard development in New Zealand and overseas. One of the issues in this field is that thankfully earthquakes that affect significant urban areas where modern earthquake standards are in fact occur very rarely. But as a consequence, when they do, there is much to learn and a heightened awareness, for example, of what can occur. As Mike outlined, New Zealand has been very fortunate in that over a period of close to 80 years, it had not had a major earthquake that had affected a significant urban area. However, over the last decade, some would suggest we've had more than our fair share of experiences with earthquakes and the resulting building damage. And this has focused minds on what might be possible and that changes to our approach to providing earthquake resistance might be in order. The experience in Christchurch during the Canterbury earthquake sequence, which saw the ultimate demolition of many of the buildings in the CBD, was brought to the fore the view that this experience was unacceptable and perhaps unsustainable for New Zealand as a whole. Engineers are always up to the challenge, however, and can think of a myriad of ways that these experiences can be mitigated. On the whole, however, almost most of the replacement buildings will be better founded from a geotechnical standpoint, and most of these will have been designed to simply meet the minimum requirements or objectives of the codes that were in place prior to the earthquakes. It can be argued that the experiences of Christchurch were that modern buildings, with the notable exception of perhaps one, largely met the life safety objectives of the building code. But the damage, although it was predicted by engineers, came as a surprise to many in our communities, whose response was you, the engineering professions, never told us that this was the likely outcome. The same questions have been raised following the earthquakes that have affected particular parts of Wellington, also within the last decade. Damage to contents and non-structural items has also come into sharp focus over the last decade, largely resulting from the lack of adherence to design provisions that were already in our design standards. The question arises, however, as to whether or not our settings for the onset of damage of non-structural items are at an appropriate level, and more about this later. When discussing resilience from a community perspective and what the objective should be, it cannot be in the context of an open checkbook. A balance needs to be and must be achieved between what is achievable from an engineering perspective and what is appropriate based on the assessed risk and the potential consequences. A balance also needs to be achieved between potential objectives. The functionality continuity focus currently in the US comes to mind, along with the acceptability of various levels of damage, and finally to the expected performance in very large levels of shaking. What is finally tolerable to the community will be dependent to some extent on how frequently various circumstances arise, something we cannot predict within the timeframes we are currently talking about. And I'd like now to consider some of the issues relating to the design process. We have, as designers, the fundamental objective to try and ensure that capacity is greater than or equal to the demand that's going to be imposed on the buildings over their lifetime. But the apparent simplicity of this equation misrepresents the complex nature of trying to achieve this. I think many will be familiar with the concept of the overlapping probability distributions for the hazard and the vulnerability, and the fact that the risk is represented by the overlapping of these two distributions. But I think what we have to recognize as designers is that when we come to look at these distributions, they're not as simple as you might think, even putting them in the probabilistic sense. And there are lots of predictions for the hazard based on different premise, and there are lots of different estimates of the fragility or the vulnerability of a building or contents at a given level of earthquake intensity. So you can see that while theoretically we can adjust the capacity so that we can adjust the risk, and obviously moving the capacity to the right of the diagram will reduce the risk, it is almost impossible to try and define actually what that risk is from a theoretical point of view. And so we need to reach a consensus, I think, on where we sit things, rather than necessarily expect us to be able to deliver from a scientific point of view where these settings should be set. From a design point of view, we don't deal with actual hazard, really, or actual performance of structures. We deal with this equation, which is a slight adaptation of the earlier one I showed, which says that the design resistance, which is the dependable resistance, must be greater than or equal to the earthquake demand as established by design, for design, so in the standards. And I think if we represent this on the diagrams, the probability diagrams previously, what we have are design points, and we have two design points which are currently, SLS1 at the serviceability level for frequent shaking, and the ULS for larger, rarer shaking. There's been a lot of discussion, certainly over the last decade, about whether we should be introducing further limit states. Of course, the ULS limit state in our current code also deals with higher levels of shaking with quite a few of the provisions as well. But if we think about other limit states, what we're really doing is introducing further design points for these limit states. And we're introducing them in a way where we are defining the earthquake action that we're thinking of for each one of these, and then we're defining the capacity, and the capacity will be associated with the distribution to deliver that limit state. There have also been discussions too about whether we should be introducing a fourth limit state, which is the MCE limit state. I think as you go from left to right on this diagram, the ability to be able, for the engineer to be able to determine exactly what is being achieved in actual performance terms becomes more and more difficult. So that needs to be borne in mind. But the important thing is that we are, from a designer's point of view, designing to a number of design points. So in terms of resilience, there are a number of issues and questions that come to mind that would have to be addressed. And these include that the building code is typically a minimum standard, so it doesn't necessarily set out what is a fully desirable state. It's a minimum state, and we need to bear that in mind. And so that's what makes the programs that Jenni outlined in terms of the low damage design guidance so important in order to give the ability to be able to adjust minimum standard as appropriate. As Mike's laid out, it's primarily based on life safety, but I would say not completely. We do have a serviceability limit state. There are many who think it's too low, and Tim set that out, and I think that's an important consideration to decide where we're setting, where these points are set. And there are the case, obviously, for other limit states. It's also important to recognise that it's relatively easy to design new buildings to a higher standard, but as Jenni set out, it is arguably much more difficult to upgrade existing, which will remain for a long time the major part of our building stock. Low damage options are available, obviously, but not all born equal, and I think we recognise this, and so it's important to be able to understand what we're getting with particular solutions. And do our current design procedures deliver? That what I outlined previously is primarily around providing the structure with sufficient strength in the appropriate places to be able to deliver objectives. But what are the roles of identifying irregularities and non-uniformities and what have you with structures? And are we reasonably penalising irregularity for the poor performance that we know from experience is delivered in almost any earthquake, and the seemingly much better performance that we get from good configurations of structures, much better than necessarily the strength levels we use in comparison with the poor buildings. And what does resilience mean in terms of performance? As I've outlined, what is the balance to be achieved and how do we get to that point? And of course, we mustn't forget the non-structural elements. They are important to include in any of these discussions. And Tim's presentation showed the effect of the performance of non-structural elements. So what could be our response to this? And what I'm going to outline now is a proposed response. I've titled it here the NZSEE Resilience Buildings Project. That's the proposal that's currently being pushed forward. And that's intended to engage in a wide-ranging discussion amongst all the potential stakeholders to this issue, with the objective of preparing a white paper that would seek to define levels of tolerable performance for various stakeholders, not in isolation of the cost, but taking that into account. It would look at recommended objectives for seismic design to deliver that tolerable performance, and it would set out the options for appropriate design approaches to deliver the objectives with an appropriate level of sophistication. Because I don't think we want to overdo the design side. Designing a building is not a research exercise, and that's not the way it's approached in design offices. So we need an appropriate level of sophistication, but one that we can be satisfied does deliver the objectives and the performance. The potential stakeholders are wide-ranging, and some of them have already been mentioned today. And I think to have a successful discussion on this topic, we need to engage with all of these stakeholders, and they all need to be able to participate and have their say. And so it's likely that any exercise along this line would have to involve very significant workshops involving representatives from all these areas. So the proposed methodology for this study is to, in the initial stages, is to engage with NZSEE membership and the wider engineering community on the context and vision for this project and this presentation this afternoon is the first step in that process. And we need to clarify the relationship between the various seismic projects, the ones that Jenni outlined, and this project, so that it's clear that they are working in conjunction with one another and not opposing one another. And there's a need to form an establishment group to frame the problem and to set up the study. And the expected timing for this, if it goes to plan, the expected timing is that we will have completed this initial phase within the first half of this year, notwithstanding the current difficulties that we have. And the objective then would be to move on and run the project. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Rob. That was the most interesting presentation. In fact, all 4 presentations were very interesting indeed. What we'd like to do now is have a discussion time. So what we need to do is start our webcams for the presenters and Ken and myself, and let's get this underway. We're going to rearrange the page too. I can see that's coming together. And I'm looking at 2 screens, so that's why I keep looking around, because I've got I've got 2 different screens in front of me here. Jenni, are you with us? Has everybody got their webcams on? And the audience, there's been many comments coming through, which are really interesting and provocative. I think our speakers have all provided some interesting insights into building resilience. And I think all of you have noted that there seems to be a mismatch between the codes, the current codes, and societal expectations. But starting off, do we really have a good idea of what are societal expectations? Seems like a good place to start, perhaps. Mike, do you want to kick it off?
Yeah, societal expectations is always very difficult because, as you pointed out, there's a range of, there will always be a huge range of views, and it's not a simple thing to get a real handle on that. And it reminds me of when we were doing the code review way back in about 2005, 2004, or 2005, I guess it was, and we held workshops in Auckland about what their expectations were for Earthquake, and they just didn't register at all at that stage. Whereas, and obviously, it was very high consideration. So I think it will depend on the proximity of the last event. People react to what they expect. It will, so there's a whole range of things. Not an easy question.
Helen, there's an interesting sub-question to that, or comment with regard to can our response to the current situation with COVID-19 tell us something about what society expects from a disaster, or at least willing to pay for better performance? And just curious as to whether any of our panel have any thoughts as to whether this current situation would suggest higher expectations than they thought before, or otherwise.
I think, Ken, if I can make a comment, I think the issue with COVID-19 is it has affected everybody, and it's affected everybody globally. Earthquakes tend to have a major effect initially on the people that are immediately affected. And so it's, and in Christchurch, when you think of Christchurch, there were many properties and areas of Christchurch which were not affected much at all. So the difficulty is, I think, in getting the acceptance for something that occurs to a relatively small area and getting that across, as opposed to the COVID-19, which has affected everybody.
Over to you, Helen.
Jenni, are you online at the moment, Jenni? Have you got any comments that you're seeing from a perspective of MBIE's observations with respect to COVID-19 and disasters and buildings?
I guess we're still starting to get a bit of a sense of sort of society's expectations in relation to the COVID-19 response. I don't know if I'm particularly well qualified to talk about that. But I certainly think it's, just would reiterate Mike's point that it's very difficult to really gauge societal expectations. I mean, they change over time and from community to community, but also, it involves sort of trying to make sure that there's a general sort of baseline understanding of probabilities.
I think, though, that what we're
and several. I think.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Mike.
Oh, sorry, Helen. I would add that I think there was a surprise. I think when Christchurch happened, I think there was a sense of even from the politicians, they didn't really recognise at the time that we're only really designing for essentially life safety. I mean, with some damage initiation type issues being addressed in the standard, but it did come as a surprise to them, and that was my point. I think about leaving this. These are sort of public policy issues, and it does need to be addressed at a government political level, who are representatives of society. Should I say that?
I was going to make one comment, though. One comment, which was that the one thing that I observed as a practicing engineer following the Christchurch earthquakes, in particular, was that it became clear that society did have expectations. They didn't understand what the standards were often for building codes, what we were really designing for, and that they wanted to think about, and it wasn't meeting what they assumed was being provided, and so there was a gap, a mismatch, and so that we need to find a way to engage and think broadly about how to get that expectation incorporated, no matter how difficult it is. I think it's just something that we are going to have to grapple with. We can't just assume that engineers, in my opinion, can determine this on behalf of society without getting criticism, and we need to work out how to engage, would be my observation about it. Anyway, moving on. Ken, did you have I'm just starting to look at all the pigeonhole questions coming in. Have you got a few that you've sort of identified that we want to pick up with everybody?
Well, I think the first one off the top there is a good one for Mike and others, and particularly Rob as well. It just moved. Can we in New Zealand maintain our own standards? And is there a need to maybe consider some alignment with international standards to support the development of our standards domestically?
Look, if I can start this off, but maybe Rob would be perhaps more qualified, but I know I've raised this issue before, and I remember at the CSOC conference a few years ago, I raised during my presentation whether people would support having Eurocode as the sort of design standard. And it was quite interesting that the room was about 1/3 split between having Eurocode, 1/3 having the American standards, and 1/3 saying, no, we can do it better ourselves. So, you know, again, that's quite difficult. I think, but I do think there is, so we probably, I mean, things like the 3101 concrete standard, you know, that sort of started off from the ACR 318 code, which I remember using when I went through university a long time ago, before we had 3101. And, you know, I think it's departed from that a bit, and I think, you know, that might have led to some of the issues that we had around the CTV collapse. There was issues around ductile columns and what have you. So, you know, maybe we should be looking more towards international codes, particularly in the materials codes. We probably still need to have our own loading standard, you know, the 1170.5. That would be my view.
Rob, do you have a comment?
Yes, I'm pretty aligned with what Mike said. I think we would have a problem adopting the Eurocodes. I think my experience in working in areas of the world where Eurocodes are to the fore is that they are quite complicated. They are very theoretical. And if we thought we would have representation in their development, I think we would be naive. And then when you go to the US, I think it takes a long time to get a code out of the process in the US. And I think maybe too long for us. And I think, like Mike, I think that probably the loading standard is one where we might say we would have to have our own, but then if we were adopting everybody else's standards, we'd have to have it tailored towards the objectives of those standards. In terms of the material standards, I have a plea that from a designer's point of view, I'm really concerned that the current standards are far too complicated. It's very difficult for design engineers to know when they've complied with the standards, especially something that's, I think when I printed it out, it was 30 millimeters thick for the concrete standard. But that is a worldwide problem. That's not New Zealand's problem. And I think that we could probably lead the world by coming up with standards that are much easier to apply, even if they lack some of the precision or the ability to amend or adjust for very particular circumstances. We might serve ourselves a lot better.
Jenny, do you have a comment from your perspective?
I think I just sort of second what Mike and Rob said. It's certainly a difficult challenge. Like there'll be a lot of efficiencies in adopting international standards, but it does mean that you know, we may not be able to contribute to that process in a way that we could with the New Zealand standard. So I guess we just need to pick and choose, you know, where it's appropriate to cite international standards and where we would want to have our own. But certainly recognise that I think the current system we have, where the building code cites hundreds and hundreds, and then, you know, they cite secondary standards, and they end up with thousands and thousands of standards in the mix, and keeping those all up to date is not particularly sustainable.
Oh, thank you. It's an interesting challenge, isn't it? Pivoting just a little bit and moving on, I see, Tim, there's a few questions about loss estimation, and Greg's asked a question about the uncertainties involved. And I saw another question earlier on, which is further down the list, about whether it is a focus on, we should be just focusing on SLS changes or also on greater intensities beyond ULS. And I'm sort of interested in your thoughts on this whole research you're doing. And so I thought I'd ask and then throw it open to the rest of the panel.
Sure, thanks, Helen. And thanks, Greg. It's a question I've seen Greg raise a few times. There are significant uncertainties in this loss assessment process, and I intentionally sort of tried to highlight the process of how we go about getting the expected annual loss. We should, of course, and this is, I think, the point Greg wants to underline through this question, recall that there are significant uncertainties in these values. But I do think it is a good tool for indicating relative performance. And in fact, the way I was talking about results was to show how one system might perform better than the other, keeping everything else constant. And we can look at how, and through this process, we can start to also identify which parts of our building, where we have uncertainties, are they significant or not? If we're talking about a component which isn't really going to be affecting our loss as much, the uncertainty we have in that component's performance is probably not so significant. But yeah, there are significant uncertainties because it is a large process. We have uncertainty in the hazard, we have uncertainty in the structural analysis assumptions, we have uncertainty in the fragility functions, and so on. But for example, taking the glazing example, we've tested now 3 different series of glazing systems. The one I presented today had a drift capacity for water tightness of about 0.35%. Another system actually has about 1% or much higher drift capacity. And this sort of loss assessment can help highlight the benefits of that to building owners in a way that I believe would help them understand what we're talking about, and in the sense that people understand what money means. They don't know necessarily what percentage MBS means, and so on. For what regards the second part of the question, Helen, you were talking about higher intensity events. Again, I think that depends on what are we interested in assessing and communicating. I think, of course, higher intensity events have a much lower likelihood of occurring, and the expected annual loss, or the average annual loss, is something that accounts for all the different intensity levels weighted by their likelihood of occurrence. So yeah, if our focus is on loss, then I don't think the high intensity are so significant. However, the insurance industry will be interested in trying to understand how much they're potentially exposed to, even though the premiums, I understand, are related more to the average annual loss or the expected annual loss. Not sure if that helps clarify.
Rob, do you have thoughts on that? Ken?
Not sure precisely on that, Helen, but I was going to say that you know, these design points that we have in our design, I keep on saying in talks, they're not chiseled in stone. You don't find them at the top of the mount. They are fairly arbitrary things, and we've got to decide what are appropriate levels. The fact that we have pinned them to some probability of occurrence in the life of the structure is, in the past or currently, is just a contrivance to get to a particular endpoint, which is ultimately just to put enough strength in structures in the right places to give confidence that they will go through everything that's been they're likely to be subjected to in their lifetime. So I'm thinking that from a low damage point of view, all we're trying to do is adjust minimum points that we might set for typical structures in building codes. don't know whether that advances the discussion, Helen. Sorry.
No, but it's it's an interesting topic, isn't it? Ken, your thoughts? I'd be interested in.
Well, maybe I was going to move things on from there, building on what Rob just noted. There's some comments around the issue of low damage design either being voluntary or being mandatory, and I guess the pros and cons of each. Maybe Rob, there was a question specifically toward you on this issue, but then I'd like to ask Jenni and Mike for their views. Any thoughts on whether if we wanted to bring in more low damage design, do we need to make it mandatory, or could we still achieve that through voluntary approaches?
You want me to respond first, Ken? Is that
sure?
Okay?
Please.
Yes, no, but I think a balance needs to be achieved. What you set out to define on a mandatory basis may not necessarily be what some building developers or owners will want to achieve. And it's important that we're able to set out the differences into where they might consider more than the minimum. So I think, yes, the country does need, from a sustainability point of view, the country needs to have a minimum objective in terms of low damage. How much you can mandate, I think, is simply a decision to be made.
Any thoughts from Jenni?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the first step in making low damage provisions mandatory is really just to make sure that everyone understands what's meant when we say low damage and talk about low damage outcomes, and know how that might fit within the design process in a consistent way. I guess I'd sort of reiterate Rob's point about sustainability, that there really is a strong linkage between low damage outcomes and sustainability and climate change when you consider the amount of sort of wasted carbon that results from buildings being demolished after an earthquake. So we're definitely sort of considering those linkages.
Mike, do you have any follow-on thoughts in this issue?
Yeah, my view is that we actually should have a clearer goal on damage and on other things, like whether you can continue to occupy the buildings and what have you. But it may be more so maybe it's not for all buildings, but for those important buildings, those buildings that, like that are potentially impacting a whole city block, like we had with the hotel in the Grand Chancellor in Christchurch. Those perhaps there should be a greater requirement for low damage, that it's not going to impact on the rest of on other people's buildings. And I think even though we do have that as a goal, is to not impact other buildings, I think it is that is inherent in the fact that if you don't have a low damage for your own buildings, you're bound to get damage that could impact on others. So I think I would like to see some sort of minimum level. I think doing the low damage design guidance is a really good start, and hopefully that is going to work from a market perspective. But market perspectives don't always work, and I think potentially once we've got a better framework, that that you could actually move to a more damage avoidance minimum requirement.
And maybe some of your comments there reflect a question here for Tim with regard to whether it would make sense to raise SLS in cities where damage has more serious economic consequences for the country, whereas leaving more of a life safety focus in regional towns. Thoughts, Tim?
Yeah, it sounds like an interesting idea. I guess in relation to this, I think in the previous sort of discussion thread, any changes we make, we can be doing research to sort of investigate the impact they're likely to have, because mandating improved performance may not change everything. There's quite a few different solutions out there, different ways we can achieve low damage without costing the earth. And so it's really about understanding and doing that work before we go in and make the change, which I guess Mike's initial comments is now is probably a good time for us to reach a consensus about what we want to achieve. And then if we are going to propose a change, just making sure we know how we'll achieve it without necessarily, some systems are going to come out winners versus others, which are currently, perhaps at the moment, they're being picked a bit equally. And maybe this whole idea of what's required could take into account impacts both on the specific building owners versus towns and communities. It's an interesting idea.
Kian, I'd just make a follow-up comment that even under the current regime, which is 1170.5, there have been over the years various steps to make sure that the damage was covered. Of course, it's arguable whether that's at the appropriate level, but we have SLS1. In Amendment 1, we introduced SLS2, mainly for parts of buildings, but the intent was that was a soft introduction, and ultimately it would be introduced for all structures. So even under the current regime, which we're not suggesting is necessarily the best approach, there is allowance for these damaged states and functionality considerations for all buildings, not just IL4.
Sort of still staying with this topic of low damage, there's a question for Jenni as to whether or not we're focusing too much on the building structure and whether or not there needs to be more emphasis on the non-structural elements. Do you think we've struck this balance appropriately within the low damage project that you described?
Certainly the low damage project is considering the performance of non-structural elements, and I 100% agree that it's critical to achieving low damage outcomes overall. But I think there's probably more that we could be doing to make sure that new buildings that are designed have appropriate restraint of non-structural elements. So not just that the settings are right, but also that we make sure that we've got appropriate sort of compliance and enforcement of those settings.
And Mike, maybe you can follow up with the comment that's been brought up here from Cam as to whether or not we need to be simpler in order to make sure that our non-structural aspects are restraints are properly installed.
Yes, look, totally agree, Cam. And I think that's the point that Rob was making. I think our codes, our standards have actually become quite complex. And I think it does need a simpler view as to what we should be aiming for. Of course, the question around it is getting compliance and making sure that the systems, and that's potentially where Tim's research is heading, what systems actually can accommodate the sort of displacements required, from a non-structural point of view. So yes, I'd agree.
Tim, along those lines, you showed the interesting tests with the impact of drift on glazing, which raises the question about sort of certification for the quality of different non-structural components. Do you have any thoughts as to how we would check to make sure that non-structural systems that are being brought onto the market actually meet the requirements for even what we would generally expect, let alone low damage?
Yeah, that's a good question. As part of the MB Quake Centre Building Innovation Partnership Project, there's a strand looking at non-structural elements, and as part of that, that involves Jan Stanway, Rajesh Dakal, and myself, and a number of people from industry. We're looking at ways and options for improving processes. I think there are a number of options. You have in the States, for example, different compliance pathways. Some of that can be shake table testing, but of course, not everyone's going to want to go and take their elements out and pay for shake table testing. So there are also other pathways. It can be even just based on experience for a certain element, or some sort of minimum requirements, and perhaps only when we really need some special performance requirements do we require more advanced specification and classification. So I don't have the answer for that yet, Ken, but it is a topic we're thinking about, and anyone interested to get involved, please let me know.
Tim and Rob and Mike and Jenny, there's an interesting question here about establishing a repairability limit state design criteria. I'm interested in your thoughts, all of you, on that idea.
That's, in fact, a good one for Ken, because in QuakeCoRE, we're currently waiting to hear the outcome of our rebid. We're hoping for QuakeCoRE to be re-supported again. And if QuakeCoRE goes ahead again next year, that will be a topic, not just repairability, but if you like, functionality is a topic that we're looking to advance. Ken, do you want to add more there?
Yeah. I think understanding better whether or not we can repair a structure after an event is critical to achieving functional recovery in an event. Whether or not you can occupy a building and in its damaged state, and then what the performance of a repaired building in a future design level earthquake would be. Those are key questions we need to answer. I think the early results seem to suggest that a lot of our buildings probably are more repairable than we gave them credit for in Christchurch. So we need to learn from that, and obviously in that case heavily influenced by our insurance structure.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Ken. Keep going.
So I think we need to look at it as a whole, both revisiting our insurance structure and just ensuring that we're getting everything out of buildings that we're able to, and able to reuse them after future events.
I guess what I wanted to add to on that topic is, I fear that if we say it's a repairable limit state, we're forgetting that, or we risk forgetting that earthquakes are going to cause, and there's going to be a whole range of intensity of shaking, and what we deem repairable for one building may not be repairable for another, might not be deemed repairable. And in some ways, do we need to introduce more limit states just to start improving repairability of buildings? I think we can get improvements in repairability without necessarily introducing new limit states, but making changes to the limit states we've got, possibly. But I did draft the idea in my presentation about a low damage, or if you like, a repairable limit state.
Yeah, I wouldn't like
Rob,
to preclude. Sorry, I wouldn't like to preclude the discussion of a repairability limit state, but I would caution that some of these performance-based ideals coming into a design standard are quite problematic, because they're not very prescriptively described unless you can do that, I would keep them out of the standard. But as Tim said, you might be able to achieve it in other ways by increasing the onset of damage, or the level of shaking at which you get the onset of damage, to trying to achieve the same objective. Trying to say once you've got a certain level of damage that you're going to be able to continue to repair it, I think it's open to a lot of subjectivity, which might be quite difficult to prescribe in a design standard.
Helen,
can I add a point?
Go ahead, Mike.
Yes, Mike, go for it.
I was just thinking, rather than a repairability limit state, well, no, again, you know, that might be a good place to start, but can we think about it as to, because some of these, you know, I'm just thinking of liquefaction in particular, it's either triggered or it's sort of not. And so there is a point at you know, there's a tipping point at which, you know, where you have to consider liquefaction. So rather than say, you know, should we be thinking in our design processes a little bit more about, you know, what is the point where liquefaction might be triggered? Is it a 50-year earthquake, or is it a 100-year earthquake? So that you get a, rather than just say, well, this is the point you have to design for. And I was just wondering whether that could also be done in the structural sense. You know, this building will be elastic up until, you know, this 100-year event or what have you, just so that people get a sense of what they're likely to get.
Well, thank you.
Of onset of damage, Mike. So yeah, we're probably very aligned there.
I think at that point, and I think there is good alignment there, we're going to have to draw this to a close. This is webinar is very much meant to be a starting the discussion, and we are going to have to close it off there, but I'd encourage everybody to keep the conversation going and keep talking to the presenters and amongst all of ourselves to promote the discussion and for everybody to contribute and think about these important issues. So I would like to close off now and thank Mike, Jenni, Tim and Rob for their very interesting and insightful presentations. I think that they were really helpful to start to frame the issues involved. And I'd like to thank everybody, all the audience and everybody who's been with us today for bearing with us in our first experience of a webinar technology. We've had a few issues. I know some people have had a few moments, and we had to cut off the webcams in this discussion session because it impacted the audio quality significantly. So that's a lesson for us, and we'll have to work out how we make that work going forward. It is rather hard to have a discussion not being able to see the other presenters, I've discovered. And finally, I would like to thank Jeff, who was the original conference convener, for organising the conference and making this webinar series possible, because it was through all of that hard work that he, as a convener, and Rajesh as the co-convener, put in, that really have created a lot of material which we're going to share through this webinar series. And so just to remind you, this is the first in this webinar series, and so please look out for announcements for the upcoming presentations and discussions that will be happening over the next several months. And thank you all for joining us.